Good evening. This is the Devar Torah on Parashat Shelach in Sefer Bamidbar. This is a very influential parsha, and it begins with the selection of spies. How does it get the term Shelach? The Bear Hashem al Moshe Lemor, Shlach Lecha Anshim Yitzeru El Eretz Canaan, Hashem Yotem Bnei Yisrael Ish Echad Avatim L'Shem Behem. And the translation of that would be, send forth ye men, you please, out of the land of Canaan that I give to the land of the children of Israel. One man from each of his father's tribe you shall send out. And when it refers to them, these are the names of the tribes. And there's 12 tribes, 12 people. Now, how does that work? Because Levi, since he wasn't getting a share of the land, he was going to get 40 cities, but his duty was not to serve in the army, but his duty was to serve working with the Mishkan. And that being the case, how did you get 12 tribes? Because the tribe of Yosef, for many purposes, divided into Yosef and Ephraim and Menashe, two sons of Yosef. They did a mission for a tour for 40 days. They came back. And when they did, they said, they slandered the land. 10 of the 12 spies, Yeshua, Ben-Nun, and Caleb, were not in that category. They said, we can conquer the land. We trust in Hashem's miracles. And one of the problems really here is where it says, Visham, Beinu et Nephilim and Anak min Nephilim, Anihi Benenu Begabiim, and Cain Hayinu Benehem. And then we saw the Nephilim, the sons of the giants among the Nephilim, we like grasshoppers in our eyes, and so we're in their eyes. In other words, they had no belief in themselves because they were looking only in themselves, and they weren't looking at the fact that Hashem was going to be there helping them. None of that came out. And when they heard the bad report, the people murmured. Now, the only ones who exception were the Levium, Moshe's tribe, and the women did not believe this and went out crying. And Hashem said, after Moshe negotiated, by saying that if he didn't bring the people up to the land, there would be a lack of respect, kavod of Hashem, honor of Hashem, because they would have said he didn't have the power to bring them in. So in that basis, he forgave them and did not wipe them out and make a new nation of Moshe. However, he said that they wanted 40 days, they toured. So for 1 day for each year, that generation who came out of Mitzrayim, Egypt, will not be allowed to enter the land of Israel. And their children, who they said will be consumed by the nation, the Canaanite nations, would be going to be the ones to inherit it. And it then goes on to describe how the people had a regret. However, again, they did not listen. And they were told not to go to Eretz Israel. Moshe and the Ark of the Torah didn't go up, but they tried to enter the land against Hashem's command, as expressed by Moshe. and they were badly beaten, which shows without Hashem's being, there was no way they could do it. However, it then goes on to give commandments for the land. So even though Hashem had said this generation isn't going on, he still talked about various offerings when there will be a sanctuary, which there already was in the temple. And after that, those commandments, it then goes on to talk about the incident of this man who gathered sticks, and on Shabbat, and Moshe asked Hashem what the punishment was, and he was executed. And after that, stoned. And after that, the last piece is Hashem says to Moshe, tells them to make tzitzit, fringes on a corner of their garments. This is the third paragraph of Kriya Shema, which we say today. And in light of this, we wear men wear a talit and praying in the morning and on Shabbat morning. In any event, that is the parsha. However, what I would like to focus on is the incident of the spies. Now, you can ask, when did the incident of the spies begin? One version you can say is that it began in Parashat Shelach. Actually, the whole incident of the spies goes much further back than that. And what I'm going to be speaking about is based on Shar Gulim and also Likutei Torah. And that's one question I wanted to discuss. And the second one is why did Kalev go alone by the Hebron? One answer that's normally given is to get away from the other spies so he wouldn't be corrupted by them into making lies of other people. However, the people and the spies, and yet there's a deeper meaning to that. But let's go back. When did the story of the 10 spies begin? And if you look at it now, when the 10 brothers of Yosef went down to Egypt to get food, Yosef repeatedly declared them to be spies. And even though it says, strange wording, it says they're spies. Now, according to the sources, Yosef was prophetic. He was right. The brothers, the neshimas of the brothers did go into the bodies of the spies. Now, if that was the case, that raises another question. Then, what happened? Then, how could the neshimas reincarnated, the souls of the brothers of Yosef, and I'll go into more detail on that in a second, how could they have possibly committed such a grievous sin as slandering the land, especially after what had happened to Miriam in the previous week's parsha? And even though she had a Tuelis in speaking what she did about Moshe, she still got saras for a week. Well, not because she had a purpose in what she did, but as a warning to the nation, which unfortunately was not heeded. Now, the picture's a little more complex. What happened is, in the beginning, it says about these spies that Yehim Mamish B'nai Israel, they were literally royal heads of the children of Israel. Now, that raises a question. You should have said they were the judges of the thousands, because there were different levels of judges, and there were judges that each judge they were responsible for 1,000 people, families, and so why does it say Wol Israel? And for that is the hint, the illusion that the souls of the 10 brothers went into the bodies of the spies. Now there's a question, there's 12 spies, so how can there be, and there's only 10 brothers because that were accused of being spies. The other two, Levi and Benjamin didn't go down to Egypt at that time, and Yosef was already there, was the viceroy. So to answer these questions, what happened is these 12 spies had their own souls. However, the brothers were sent, one to each tribe, were sent as Iburim. Now, an Ibur is sometimes if a person has a major challenging task, he or she is given an Ibur, which is an extra show of a tzaddik or tzedekis to help them. And therefore, when it says, so therefore these tribes were Iburim, they helped the spies. Now, what happened then is each of the tribes now there were 12 tribes. So what happened? How did this work out? 10 of the tribes were 10 of the spies had 10 of the tribes. Now, how do we get 12? Because since Levi is not included, the 12 tribes were going to be, Yosef was split into two, and that's how Yosef was split into two. And we also see, we see that. Now, so one went, so one of the tribes, Yosef's neshama went to Menashe. Now, and into Yeshua's neshama was added a yud, and with that, that attracted Levi to enter him, and that's where you. So the only one, excuse me. So Yeshua did not have a tribe. Levi went into Elav. So who was the 12th tribe? The Yeshua did not have had you had added to his name. He went from Hoshea to Yehoshua. In light of that, Yehuda came, the neshama of Yehuda came down to him, And that's how we get the 12 tribes, 12 spies. And as the Parsha goes on to explain, when you look at the language, it said these men, referring to you, who survived. 10 of the spies were punished by Hashem and destroyed for their slander. The other 2 who survived. Now, what does that mean? They had their extra Ebor. And they kept theirs. Now, when it says, how do we know that didn't happen to the other spies? Because when it came back, it said they came back to land after 40 years, 40 days touring the land. And then it says they came back and reported to Moshe and Aaron. Why do we need a second repetition that they came back? We already know that. And it's explaining that the people who came back, in that case, the 10 spies who slandered the land, the Iborim, the extra souls of the brothers that had gone, had left before they were going to slander the land. So even though Hashem gave them the help of this Ibor, it wasn't enough for them to overcome the Yetzer Hara and not to slander the land. And now, to answer the question in the case of Kalev, why did Kalev go to Hebron? Because he was really a descendant of Eliezer, Abraham's servant. And theoretically, as a Canaanite, that should not have been a good descent. However, when he went to Laban to find a wife for Yitzchak named Rivka, Laban said he was the blessed of God, and that removed from him that problem of being a Canaanite, was taken away from him, and therefore he was a Kalev, to be a descendant of his, and Kalev fully took on. Now, what was the consequences? So because of the spies, they basically set history back many, many generations, because what would have happened if they had not slandered the land? Then everybody would have gone up. People would have gone up. Moshe would have led the people. And if Moshe had led the people, it would have been a miraculous entry into Eretz Israel. And not only that, instead of the temple, location of the temple being discovered over 400 years later, and Moshe's merit would have been discovered immediately. And the people would have been in an elevated height spiritually, even after the sin of the golden calf, and it would have been redemption. In other words, Mashiach becoming of the ultimate redemption, the ultimate purpose of the world, would have been fulfilled thousands of years ago. Now, how do we know that? Because we see in the previous parsha, and I discussed this also in last week's parsha, there are 2 pesukim that are very unusual. They're surrounded by inverted nuns. One of them is Yehin and Nasa, Aaron v'Omer Moshe, Kuma Hashem Yifutzu v'Vecha v'Nasu v'Mishanecha v'Necha v'Nukla Amer Shavu v'Hashem v'Bos Alafei Yisrael. When the ark would travel, Moshe said, Hashem, and let your foes be scattered by those who hate you, flee from you. And when arrested, it would reside tranquilly, Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel. Now, that was a very summarized version of what would have been a larger book if the spies hadn't slandered the land and the entry into Eretz Israel hadn't been set back 40 years, which was going to have the consequence that Moshe would not be able to enter the land because of later on in the 40th year in the desert, instead, when water was needed, instead of speaking to the rock, he broke it, something else to expand on. and one in Parshas Shelach, which is a couple of weeks from now. And therefore, when it says the enemies would flee, would be that symbolizing miraculous entry. When it's talking about the settling, it's talking about the ultimate settling in Israel, that the ark would have resided in the first temple, which would have been the second and third temples, and the history's purpose would have been fulfilled, would have been no exiles. And that raises another question, and this is one of the connections with the nuns. What would have, so this was a concise history, bookended. It would have been far more greater, and the details if it hadn't. So the question that remains here then is the following. If the people had sinned, even though Hashem had given them, what was the merit that allowed them in? Now, I would like to take something that was brought by the Leshem, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, and he explained that when the people exited Egypt, why did Hashem rescue us? We didn't have any merits. Now, in the Haggadah, it says we got a couple of merits. What were those couple of merits? One of those merits was the two merits, the two bloods. One was slaughtering the sheep, which was the Egyptian god, and painting the blood on the lentil. That was one. And the second one was the blood of bris milah, which was a difficult thing to do, especially when they were going to be traveling shortly thereafter while recuperating from bris milah and circumcision. And it's explained that it's the letters Nun. Now, not the letter Nun itself that saved them, but Nun represents the 50 levels of Hashem's wisdom, which Hashem guides the world. And in the merit of that, in Hashem's divine plan, were the people taken out of Egypt and rescued at Yam Suf, the Red Sea, even though they did not merit it. And I'd like to suggest that those nuns are a remez, an allusion, a hint to what would have happened, that in the merit of those, same type of thing, in the merit of those 50 levels of Bina of Hashem's wisdom, 50 levels of Kedusha, specialness, was Hashem, in the merit of that, allowed the people to come into Israel 40 years later. It's more than just a fulfillment of his promise. And as we are now having and experiencing over the last number of decades, the final entry into the land, may we all work in learning and mitzvahs to help take the final steps to bring redemption. With Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.